The rain hammered against the cedar planks of the ark, a rhythmic, deafening roar that drowned out the cries of the world outside. Every timber groaned under the assault of the rising tide. Inside the lower hold, the air was thick, stagnant, and tasted of salt and old wood. Noah moved through the darkness, his hand sliding along the damp, splintered walls until his fingers met something that did not belong. It was cold. It was smooth. It was metal. He pressed his palm against the surface, feeling a faint, rhythmic vibration pulsing from deep within. This was no ordinary vessel built for survival. It was a vault, sealed with a technology that defied the craftsmanship of the age. He traced the edges of the metallic seal, his breath hitching as the ship tilted violently, throwing him against the bulkhead. The metal remained ice cold, indifferent to the chaos raging outside. He pulled his hand away, his skin stinging from the contact. The sanctuary was a cage, and whatever was locked inside was beginning to wake up. Noah pulled his hand back, the metallic seal still humming against his fingertips. He turned, his boots scraping against the wet floorboards, and scanned the dark corners of the hold. The storm outside roared, a constant, crushing weight that made the ship shudder. He expected to be alone, but the air felt thin, charged with a static that made the hair on his arms stand up. He took a step toward the center of the hold. A sudden crack of thunder shook the entire structure, and for a split second, the interior was bathed in a harsh white glare from the cracks in the hull. In that flash, he saw her. She stood in the furthest corner, tucked deep into the shadows where the light barely reached. She did not move as the ship groaned. Noah squinted, his heart hammering against his ribs. He moved closer, his hand hovering near the hilt of his blade. As the next bolt of lightning struck, the hold flickered again. The light caught her face, and he saw them. Her eyes were glowing with a deep, pulsating violet hue. Noah stopped 3 paces from her. The air between them felt heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that rattled his teeth. She did not look at him. Her attention remained locked on the metallic seal embedded in the hull. Her hands moved, slow and deliberate, drawing something from the darkness. It was a crystalline vial, no larger than a human heart, and it pulsed with a rhythmic, steady light that mirrored the heartbeat of the ship. Every time the vial flared, the seal on the wall flared in response. She held it out, her fingers tightening around the glass, and the light intensified, casting long, jagged shadows across the hold. Noah watched the pulse, his breath catching in his throat. The artifact was not merely glowing, it was breathing. It was a fragment of the world that existed before the rain, a piece of technology that defied the laws of nature. As she tilted the vial, a faint, high-pitched whine filled the hold, drowning out the roar of the storm. The ship groaned, shifting under the pressure of the deep, but the woman stood unmoved. She was the anchor. Noah reached out, his hand trembling, but the light from the vial surged, pushing him back with an invisible kinetic force. The sanctuary had been breached. Far above the churning black ocean, the peaks of Mount Hermon pierced the storm clouds like jagged teeth. The air here was thin, biting, and tasted of ozone. Standing on the highest ridge, the Nephilim giants loomed against the lightning-streaked sky. They were massive, their skin the color of wet slate, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the ark drifted into the abyss. They did not speak. They did not move against the gale. They simply watched the vessel vanish into the rising dark. Then, the shift began. The tallest of them raised a hand, and the air around his fingers started to shimmer. It was not a death. It was a shedding of form. His massive frame began to ripple, the solid muscle turning translucent, then gray, then vaporous. One by one, the others followed. The giants were dissolving, their physical weight shedding away into a thick, unnatural mist that clung to the mountain slopes. This was the transmutation. As the last of their solid forms vanished into the swirling fog, the mist detached from the peaks. It began to descend, flowing down the mountain like a silent, predatory tide. Deep within the belly of the ark, The air grew thick with the sharp metallic tang of ozone and the heavy scent of ancient decay. Ham moved through the narrow, twisting corridors, his boots silent against the damp wood. The walls here were not merely planks. They were etched with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light of his torch. He stopped, his fingers tracing the deep grooves carved into the timber. These were not the markings of a shipwright. They were geometric sequences, complex and unsettling, depicting the forbidden alchemy of the fallen ones. He followed the lines with his fingertips, feeling the rough texture of the wood and the strange, cold vibration that emanated from the carvings. Every turn of the pattern led to another, a map of knowledge that defied the natural order of the world. He knew now that the Ark was not just a vessel for survival. It was a library of secrets waiting to be unlocked. The corridor ended at a bulkhead that lacked the standard bracing of the rest of the ship. Ham pressed his palm against the wood, feeling a subtle, rhythmic vibration that did not match the groan of the hull. He ran his fingers along the edge of a vertical seam, finding a recessed latch hidden behind a layer of grime. He wedged a flat metal blade into the gap, applying steady, calculated pressure. The wood shrieked, the fibers snapping under the strain until the panel swung inward. Inside, resting on a bed of dry, preserved moss, lay a scroll. It was not made of parchment, but of a thin, translucent material that felt like cold glass. Ham pulled it out, his hands moving with a sudden, sharp precision. He unrolled the scroll, and the light from his torch caught the ink. It was not a map or a list of supplies. It was a sequence of complex interlocking spirals, a genetic blueprint that defied every law of nature he had ever known. He stared at the patterns, his breath hitching in the silence. These were the building blocks of life, rewritten and corrupted by the fallen ones. The betrayal was no longer a thought. It was a physical weight in his hand. Ham spread the scroll across a flat crate, his eyes darting between the interlocking spirals and the ship's manifest. The genetic sequences were not random. They were a blueprint for a specific, non-human lineage. He traced the final, complex helix, then looked toward the upper deck where the others remained. His mind raced, connecting the forbidden data. He crept toward the shadows of the main hold, his movements calculated and silent. There, he saw her. The daughter-in-law stood near the central mast, her gaze fixed on the dark, churning water beyond the hull. In her hand, she clutched a crystalline vial. Ham froze, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. She was not merely a survivor. She was the vessel. The air around her shimmered, warping the light, as if the very space she occupied was unstable, her eyes reflecting that same unnatural violet hue. Ham tucked the scroll away, his resolve hardening into a cold, singular purpose. Ham tucked the scroll into a hidden pocket, his movements sharp and efficient. As he turned to leave the compartment, the Ark lurched violently. A sound like 1,000 iron bars snapping echoed through the lower hold. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the soles of his feet and rattled his teeth. The pressure of the deep sea was mounting, pushing against the cedar planks with a force that defied structural integrity. Water began to seep through the seams, thin, dark lines of moisture tracing the wood grain. Ham grabbed a support beam, his knuckles white as he braced against the sudden tilt of the floor. The ship shuddered again, a prolonged, metallic shriek that drowned out the rhythmic beating of the rain. He looked up at the ceiling, watching as the joints strained, the massive timbers bowing under the weight of the abyss. Every creak was a reminder of the fragility of their sanctuary. He moved toward the ladder, his body swaying with the erratic motion of the vessel. He focused only on the path ahead, his grip tightening on the wood as the Ark groaned once more. A final, bone-shaking impact tore through the hull. The Ark shuddered, the wood screaming as it ground against jagged stone. Then, the motion stopped. The violent, rhythmic pounding of the rain against the roof cut out instantly, leaving a void where the noise had been. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It pressed against the ears like deep water. Inside, the only sound was the settling of the massive timbers, a slow, rhythmic groaning as the ship wedged itself into the mountain peak. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, hanging suspended in the stagnant air. The ship tilted slightly, a permanent, unnatural angle that defied the horizon. Every inhabitant stood frozen in the sudden stillness, waiting for the next movement that did not come. The pressure of the deep vanished. The air grew sharp, smelling of wet rock and ancient, undisturbed ice. Outside, the clouds began to tear apart, revealing a sky hidden for an eternity. The ship was no longer a vessel of the sea. It was a tomb of wood and iron. The silence was not peaceful. It was a held breath. Noah pressed his shoulder against the hatch, the wood groaning in protest. It had swollen shut over the long months, the salt and moisture sealing the frame tight. He braced his feet, muscles straining, and shoved with everything he had. The seal broke with a sharp, splintering crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent hold. The hatch swung outward, and the air rushed in a sudden, biting cold that stung the back of his throat. He stumbled forward, his boots sinking into a thick, slick layer of mud that coated the mountain peak. He gasped, his lungs burning as they filled with the sharp, clean oxygen of high altitude. It was a violent physical shock after the stale, recycled air of the hold. He stood upright, his legs trembling from the sudden shift in gravity. Below him, the world was a jagged, unrecognizable landscape of gray stone and swirling mist. He stood alone on the summit, breathing in the silence of a world that had been scrubbed clean, entirely unaware that the corruption had stepped out onto the mud right behind him. Noah turned back to the ship, his voice catching in his throat as he prepared to call for his family. He expected to see them huddled in the threshold, waiting for his signal. Instead, he saw only the dark, gaping maw of the hold. A flicker of movement at the prow drew his eyes upward. Ham stood there, silhouetted against the jagged, splintered wood of the ship's frame. He was not looking at the mud, or the sky, or the horizon. He was looking at his hand. Noah froze, his breath hitching as he focused on the object clutched in his son's grip. It was a small, crystalline vial, pulsing with a rhythmic violet light. Ham's fingers were locked around the glass, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood, the artifact held out like a beacon, his gaze fixed on the distance where the mist began to churn. In that moment, the truth of the voyage shifted. The ship was not a vessel of salvation. It was a delivery mechanism. Noah looked at the artifact, then back at the ship, and the cold reality settled into his marrow. The flood had washed away the surface, but the core of the infection remained. It was not in the wood of the hull or the iron of the seals. It was in the blood of those who had stepped off the gangplank. He watched Ham's fingers, steady and unyielding around the crystalline vial, and understood the true purpose of their survival. The Ark had not been a vessel of salvation. It was a Trojan horse, designed to carry the forbidden genetic code across the threshold of the new world. The virus was not a pathogen that could be purged by water or wind. It was woven into the very DNA of the survivors. Noah's hands trembled as he looked at his own palms, wondering what dormant sequences were already unfolding within his own cells. The silence of the mountain peak felt different now, no longer clean, but heavy with the weight of an unfinished war. He stood on the edge of the abyss, watching the realization dawn on Ham's face, knowing that the history of the world had not ended, but had merely been rewritten. Ham did not look at his father. He looked toward the horizon, where the jagged line of the earth met the gray, bruised sky. The artifact in his hand pulsed faster now, a rapid, rhythmic strobe of violet light that matched the sudden, violent tremors beneath their feet. The ground on the far slope began to heave. It was not a landslide, but a deliberate, upward pressure. Clumps of mud and stone erupted into the air as something massive pushed through the crust of the new world. Noah stumbled, his hands clawing at the wet earth to keep his balance, but the shaking was absolute. From the fissures in the soil, the first of the Rephaim rose. They were not made of mist, but of solid, shifting matter limbs, thick as ancient trunks. Ham stepped forward, his gaze locked on the rising figures, his posture shifting into a stance of recognition. The code had been activated. The flood had not ended the war. It had only provided the soil for the next generation to take root. Centuries bled into the dust of the valley of Elah. The memory of the flood had faded into legend, but the bloodline remained, a silent current running beneath the surface of human history. The valley was quiet, save for the dry whistle of wind through the scrub brush and the sudden, rhythmic crunch of gravel under immense weight. A shadow stretched across the sun-baked floor, long and distorted, moving with a deliberate, predatory grace. From behind a ridge of limestone, a figure stepped into the open. He was not a man of ordinary measure. His frame blocked the light, casting a pall of darkness over the path ahead. He moved with a heavy, ground-shaking cadence. As he reached the center of the clearing, he paused, his posture rigid and alert. He raised a hand to shield his eyes from the glare, and the sunlight caught the detail of his palm. 4 fingers, then a 5th, and a 6th, splayed wide against the horizon. The giant did not move for a long time, his breathing a slow, rhythmic rasp that stirred the dust at his feet. He reached down into the dense thicket beside him, his fingers closing around a shaft of dark, polished wood. With a single, fluid motion, he pulled it from the earth. It was a spear, its length nearly twice that of a man, the head forged from a metal that caught the sun with a dull, bruised shimmer. He gripped the shaft, his 6-fingered hand wrapping around the wood until the knuckles turned white with the pressure of his hold. The weight of the weapon was immense, yet he balanced it with ease, the tip dipping and rising in a hypnotic arc. As he tilted the spear, the metal hummed a low, vibrating frequency that resonated in the hollows of the valley. The ancient corruption was no longer hidden. It was armed, and it was ready to claim the world. The valley of stone and dust vanished, replaced by the humming silence of a sterile laboratory. Here, the air was filtered, cold, and smelled of ozone and synthetic reagents. Rows of high-resolution monitors cast a pale, flickering light across the faces of researchers who stared at the scrolling data. They were not looking for history in the dirt. They were searching for it in the double helix. A cursor blinked on a screen, highlighting a sequence that refused to align with any known biological model. One researcher tapped a key, zooming into the code. The sequence was dense, repetitive, and ancient. It did not belong to the natural order of human evolution. As they cross-referenced the markers, the patterns began to mirror the structural anomalies found in the forgotten records of the past. The data shifted, revealing fragments of a genetic architecture that predated the flood. It was a biological ghost, a persistent, dormant signature woven into the very fabric of human life. The scientists leaned closer, their eyes tracking the anomalous loops and jagged connections. They were looking at the unfinished business of a history that had never truly been buried. The screen glowed with the truth of the discovery, a cold, digital confirmation that the bloodline of the giants was not a legend, but a living, breathing component of the modern human genome. The focus in the laboratory narrowed to the vast, unmapped regions of the human genome. For decades, researchers dismissed these long, repetitive stretches of code as junk, a biological archive of evolutionary debris. But as the sequence scrolled across the high-definition displays, the patterns began to pulse with a rhythmic, artificial cadence. A senior analyst leaned forward, fingers hovering over the glass, as the digital model of the helix began to uncoil. It was not static. The strands shifted, reconfiguring themselves into a complex geometric architecture that defied standard biological logic. This was not random noise. It was a dormant, encrypted command. The markers identified earlier acted as a master key, unlocking the silence. As the code expanded, the monitors displayed a structural blueprint that mirrored the ancient, forbidden alchemy of the pre-flood world. The junk DNA was not a relic of the past, but the active, waiting precursor to an inevitable, future transformation. The Ark was never merely a vessel of salvation. It was a Trojan horse, a silent carrier of a corruption that the rising waters were meant to erase. History has long framed the flood as a finality, a cleansing of the earth that left the slate clean. But the evidence now surfacing in the deepest layers of our own biology suggests a different truth. The flood washed away the surface, yet the core of the ancient anomaly remained, shielded within the DNA of the survivors. We look back at the records of the past as myths, yet the genetic markers tell a story of continuity, not extinction. The conflict that began on the peaks of Mount Hermon did not vanish into the abyss. It simply migrated into the blood of humanity. Every generation has carried this hidden cargo, an inheritance of the fallen ones that refuses to be silenced. The vessel that once scraped against the rocks of Ararat did not just bring life to a new world. It brought the seeds of a recurring, ancient war. The sun sets on our era, yet the horizon holds the same shadows that haunted the peaks of Mount Hermon. We are the custodians of a secret that was never meant to survive the flood. The code is not merely present, it is waiting. Every environmental shift, every pulse of radiation, every subtle change in the atmosphere acts as a potential key. We have spent centuries looking to the stars for signs of our origin, failing to realize that the answer is locked within our own cells. The giants are not myths. They are the unfinished business of a history we are only beginning to decode. The silence of the genome is temporary. As the dormant sequences begin to align, the boundary between the human and the ancient begins to blur. If the bloodline survived the total destruction of the world once, what happens when the dormant code is finally triggered again? The question is no longer if the past will return, but how we will survive the moment our own biology decides to wake up.